Mika had always known that driving around in her dad's car would eventually draw attention. But she didn't expect it today, not when she was just heading home from picking up groceries with her baby sleeping peacefully in the back seat. The car, a sleek, black sedan, was one of the few indulgences her adoptive father, Judge John Smith, had allowed himself over the years. And now, as Mika saw the flashing lights of a police car behind her, a knot of anxiety twisted in her stomach. Her heart raced as she pulled the car to the side of the road. She'd been cautious, following every traffic rule to the letter, but the familiar sense of dread washed over her. She glanced into the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of her son, still asleep, blissfully unaware of the tension crackling in the air. "It'll be fine," she whispered to herself, though her hands shook slightly as she reached for her driver's license and registration. The officer, a tall, heavy-set man with a stern expression, approached the car with slow, deliberate steps. His presence felt imposing, and Mika could feel his gaze scanning the car, even before he reached the window. She lowered it and offered him a shaky but polite smile. "Good afternoon, officer," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. Officer Reed ignored her greeting. His eyes, cold and unfeeling, quickly flicked from Mika's face to the baby in the back seat. His lips twisted in a way that sent a chill down Mika's spine. "License and registration," he said flatly, his voice lacking any warmth or politeness. Mika handed over the documents without hesitation, though her fingers trembled slightly. She could already sense where this was going, but she hoped she was wrong. Reed barely glanced at the documents before his eyes moved back to her, scrutinizing every inch of her. His expression was one of disbelief, as though something about her didn't add up. "Whose car is this?" he asked, his voice sharp, accusatory. "It's my dad's," Mika replied, forcing herself to sound confident. "I'm just borrowing it." Reed raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Your dad's," he repeated, the disbelief clear in his voice. His eyes flicked to the back seat again, where Mika's baby stirred slightly in his car seat. "And where's this dad of yours?" Mika felt the tension in her chest grow. "He's at home," she answered cautiously. "I'm just running some errands for him." Reed stared at her for a moment, his gaze hard and calculating. "And whose baby is that in the back seat?" he asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. Mika felt her stomach tighten. "That's my son," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Reed snorted, shaking his head slowly as if he had expected as much. 16 and already got a kid, ha, he muttered under his breath, loud enough for her to hear. He took a step back, scanning the car once more. "And you expect me to believe this car is yours or your dad's?" "I'll tell you what I think. I think your boyfriend or brother gave you this car after he stole it. Figured you'd be less suspicious driving it, right?" Mika's heart raced, her mouth going dry. What she stammered. "I told you this is my dad's car. I didn't steal anything." But Officer Reed wasn't listening. His eyes narrowed as he folded his arms across his chest. "Right," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But because a 16-year-old black girl driving a car like this? Sure, you're either lying or you're covering for someone else who stole it. Either way, this doesn't add up." Mika's breath caught in her throat. She had heard stories like this before, had read about them in the news, but now, experiencing it firsthand, the reality was so much worse. The assumptions, the judgment, the blatant racism, it hit her like a punch to the gut. Officer Reed leaned down slightly, his face closer to hers. "You're going to sit here while I run these plates," he said, his voice a thinly veiled threat. "And don't try anything funny, I'll be watching you." Mika nodded numbly, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly as she watched Reed walk back to his patrol car. Her heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the situation pressing down on her like a ton of bricks. She hadn't done anything wrong, but she could feel herself sinking deeper into a situation that felt out of her control. She glanced back at her son, who had begun to stir, and the wave of protectiveness that surged through her was overwhelming. She couldn't let this escalate. She had to call her dad. He would know what to do. With shaking hands, Mika grabbed her phone and dialed her father's number. It rang once, twice before his familiar steady voice came through the line. "Hey Mika," Judge Smith greeted warmly. "Everything okay?" Mika's voice trembled as she replied, "Dad, I've been pulled over." There was a brief pause on the other end, and Mika could hear the change in her father's tone. Pulled over? Why? What happened? I don't know, Mika whispered, her eyes flicking toward the patrol car in her rearview mirror. The officer, he's saying things, Dad. He thinks I stole your car. Another pause, this one longer. Stay calm, Mika, her father said, his voice firm but reassuring. I'm not far behind you. Just sit tight and don't argue with him. I'll be there soon. Mika exhaled shakily, her father's words offering a sliver of comfort in the midst of the storm. Okay, please hurry, she whispered, her heart pounding as she hung up the phone. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. Mika kept her eyes on the rearview mirror, watching as Officer Reed remained in his car, no doubt running her plates, searching for something, anything to confirm his suspicions. She could feel his eyes on her, could feel the judgment hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Reed emerged from his patrol car, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips as he approached her window once more. Mika's heart raced, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Well, Reed drawled, leaning down to her window again. Turns out this car belongs to someone named John Smith. That your dad's name, is it? Mika nodded, her stomach twisting in knots. Yes, sir. He's my adoptive father. Reed's smirk widened, his eyes gleaming with smug satisfaction. Adoptive father, huh? Sure. Let me guess, he's some rich white guy who just happens to have a black daughter driving his expensive car. You really expect me to believe that? Mika's breath hitched, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a lead blanket. It's the truth, she said softly, though her voice shook with a mix of fear and anger. Reed chuckled darkly, shaking his head. Right, he said again, his voice thick with sarcasm. Well, let's just see what your dad has to say about all this. But I wouldn't get too comfortable if I were you. People like you don't usually come out of situations like this looking too good. Mika's heart sank further, the reality of her situation hitting her full force. She had done nothing wrong. But here she was, a 16-year-old black girl being treated like a criminal, being judged for the car she drove, for the color of her skin, for the baby in the back seat. She hadn't stolen anything, hadn't broken any laws. But none of that seemed to matter to Officer Reed. In his eyes, she was already guilty. As Reed turned to walk back to his car, Mika's phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was her father. He was almost there. Mika exhaled slowly, a mixture of relief and dread swirling in her chest. She knew her father would handle this, but the damage had already been done. No matter what happened next, she had already been judged, already been made to feel like she didn't belong, just another black girl in the wrong place, driving the wrong car. Mika's heart raced as she fumbled with her phone, her hands trembling slightly as she dialed her father's number. Her eyes darted nervously to Officer Reed, who was still pacing near his patrol car, glancing back at her occasionally as though watching for any sudden movements. The air in the car felt thick, suffocating with the weight of unspoken accusations. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, treated like a criminal. The phone rang once, twice, before her father's warm voice filled her ear. Hey Mika, what's going on, sweetheart? She exhaled shakily, trying to hold back the tears that were threatening to spill over. Dad, I got pulled over, she said, her voice small, filled with an anxiety that she tried to hide. There was a pause on the other end, a brief silence where she could imagine her father's calm expression shifting to concern. Pulled over? For what? You weren't speeding, were you? His voice remained calm, but Mika could hear the underlying tension. No, Dad, I didn't do anything, Mika whispered, glancing at Officer Reed, who was still hovering nearby, eyes trained on her. The officer, he's treating me like I stole your car. He keeps asking where you are, and he doesn't believe me when I tell him it's your car. Another pause, this one longer. Okay, Judge Smith said finally, his voice steady but firm. Stay calm, Mika. Don't argue with him. I'll be there soon, I'm not far behind you. Mika nodded, even though her father couldn't see her. Okay, Dad, please hurry. He's saying things that she trailed off, her throat tightening as she tried to find the words. How could she explain the way Officer Reed's eyes had scrutinized her, the way his words cut into her like tiny blades? Judge Smith's voice softened slightly. It's going to be okay. Just stay put, and I'll handle it when I get there. I'm proud of you for staying calm. Thanks, Dad, she whispered, her fingers tightening around the phone as she hung up. She placed it in her lap and stared out the window, trying to slow her breathing, trying to focus on the sound of her son sleeping peacefully in the back seat. But all she could feel was the suffocating weight of Officer Reed's assumptions bearing down on her. As if sensing her thoughts, Officer Reed approached the car again, his face set in that same cold expression as he stopped by the window. He didn't bother with any pleasantries this time. I ran the plates, he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. This car belongs to someone named John Smith. He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. That's your dad? Mika nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. Yes, sir. He's my adoptive father. Reed raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. Adoptive father, huh? And what's his address? Mika's stomach tightened, and she hesitated for a second before answering. We live just down the road on Birchwood Drive. Reed nodded slowly, but there was no acceptance in his expression. He leaned down a little closer, his eyes locked onto hers with a sharpness that made her skin crawl. So let me get this straight, he began, his tone dripping with condescension. You're a 16-year-old black girl driving a very expensive car that belongs to a man named John Smith, who just happens to be your adoptive father. And I'm supposed to believe that this car wasn't stolen? That this isn't part of some little scheme you've got going on with a boyfriend or a brother? Mika's breath hitched, her heart pounding painfully in her chest. I told you, sir, this is my dad's car. I didn't steal anything. Reed straightened up, his expression growing more smug by the second. Right, he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. Because this makes perfect sense. A girl like you, black, young, and already with a kid in the backseat, just driving around in a fancy car that you definitely didn't steal. And you expect me to believe that? Ha. Mika's throat tightened, and she fought back the rising tide of anger that threatened to spill over. She clenched her hands into fists, her nails digging into her palms as she tried to stay calm, tried to remind herself of her father's words. Stay calm, she repeated silently to herself. Dad's coming. Reed let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head. I've seen this kind of thing before, he muttered, more to himself than to her. You get someone like your boyfriend to steal the car. Then you drive it around, hoping no one will suspect you. Smart move, really. Throw in a baby for sympathy, and people just might let it slide. He looked back at the sleeping baby in the back seat, his smirk deepening. But not me. I see right through it. Mika's anger bubbled dangerously close to the surface, her fingers digging harder into her palms until she could feel the sting of her nails. This isn't fair, she thought. She hadn't done anything wrong, but here she was, being accused, being judged, being diminished by someone who didn't know her, who didn't care to know her. To him, she was just another black girl in a nice car, another statistic waiting to be proven guilty. Reed's radio crackled, and he stepped away from the car for a moment, his hand moving to his belt as he spoke into it, confirming some detail with dispatch. Mika watched him closely, her heart still racing, every second feeling like an eternity. She just needed her father to get here. Everything would be okay once he arrived. It had to be. When Reed returned, his smirk was gone, replaced with a look of determination. All right, he said, his voice taking on an official tone. We're going to sort this out back at the station. You'll need to come with me. Mika's eyes widened, panic rising in her chest. What? Why? I didn't do anything. Reed shrugged, his expression indifferent. You say that now, but I'm not taking any chances. If this car is stolen, we'll figure it out soon enough. And if it's not, then you've got nothing to worry about, do you? Mika's mind reeled, her thoughts spinning out of control. She was innocent. She had done nothing wrong. But none of that seemed to matter. Reed had already made up his mind, already decided who she was, and it didn't matter what she said. To him, she was guilty until proven otherwise. As the panic built in her chest, Mika heard the familiar rumble of a car pulling up behind them. She glanced into the rearview mirror and saw her father's car coming to a stop. Relief washed over her, and for the first time since the stop, she felt like she could breathe again. Reed noticed the car too, his eyes narrowing slightly as Judge Smith stepped out. Mika watched as her father approached, his expression calm but serious, his eyes locking onto Reed's. "Good afternoon," Officer Judge Smith said, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable weight. "I'm John Smith, and I believe you've been speaking with my daughter." Reed's eyes flicked from Mika to her father, and for the first time there was a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. "Your daughter," he repeated, clearly taken aback. "Yes," Judge Smith said, his voice growing firmer. "My daughter. And I'd like to know why she's being treated as though she's done something wrong." Mika watched as Reed's expression shifted, the smugness faltering as he seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. But the damage had already been done. She could feel it in the air, the weight of the accusations, the assumptions, the judgment that had been cast upon her simply because of who she was, what she looked like. And though her father was here now, ready to defend her, the sting of Reed's words still lingered, a reminder of the battle she would continue to face, over and over again. As the black sedan pulled up behind Mika's car, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. Her father, Judge John Smith, had arrived. She watched him step out, his tall figure moving with calm authority, his presence instantly changing the dynamic of the scene. For a moment, Officer Reed, who had been hovering near Mika's window, glanced up, clearly surprised by the arrival of the imposing figure. Judge Smith walked toward the two vehicles with purposeful steps, his face composed but stern. As he neared, his eyes moved from the officer to his daughter, and though his expression remained calm, Mika could see the fire of protective fury simmering just beneath the surface. "Good afternoon," Officer Judge Smith greeted, his voice steady, but there was an unmistakable undertone of authority in his words. "I'm John Smith. I believe there's been some sort of misunderstanding here." Officer Reed stiffened, visibly taken aback by the man's introduction. For a split second, he looked uncertain, his bravado faltering. But he quickly recovered, straightening his posture and attempting to regain control of the situation. "Good afternoon," Sir Reed replied, his tone more cautious now. "I was just performing a routine traffic stop, and—" "Routine," Judge Smith interrupted, his gaze narrowing slightly. "Routine, you say? From what my daughter has told me, this stop has been anything but routine. In fact, it seems to me that you've been accusing her of theft without any real evidence, I might add." Reed shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward Mika, then back to Judge Smith. "Well, sir, I was simply trying to verify the ownership of the vehicle," Reed began, clearly scrambling to explain himself. "You understand, a young girl like her, driving a car like this, with a baby in the back seat. I had to make sure everything was in order." Judge Smith's expression hardened. "I see," he said slowly, the weight of his words sinking in like a judge delivering a verdict. "So you stopped her because she's a young black girl driving a nice car, and you assumed, without evidence, that she must have stolen it." Reed opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The officer's face flushed as he struggled to find a defense. "No, sir, I didn't mean." Judge Smith took a step closer, his calm demeanor now layered with cold disapproval. "You didn't mean what? Officer Reed? You didn't mean to accuse my daughter of being a thief simply because of her skin color? You didn't mean to profile her and assume the worst because of some preconceived notion you have about black people and crime?" Reed's face paled as the gravity of the situation became clear. He had no idea who he was dealing with. This wasn't just some ordinary citizen. Judge Smith's presence loomed over him like a storm cloud, and the officer realized too late that he was in over his head. "I'm deeply sorry," Sir Reed stammered, his voice shaky now. "It was never my intention to." "Wasn't it?" Judge Smith's voice was cold, cutting through Reed's feeble attempts at an apology. "Because it seems to me that your intention was very clear. You saw a young black girl, and you assumed she was guilty of something. You assumed the car was stolen, and you treated her with suspicion and disrespect from the moment you pulled her over. Am I wrong, officer?" Reed's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. The weight of the accusations hung heavy in the air, and for the first time the officer looked unsure of himself. He glanced nervously at Mika, who was watching the scene unfold from her car, her heart pounding in her chest. I apologize, Reed said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I was just doing my job, sir. I didn't mean to cause any offense. Judge Smith stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he stepped closer, his voice lowering but carrying even more weight. Officer Reed, I am a Supreme Court justice. I have spent my entire career upholding the law, ensuring that justice is served fairly and without prejudice. What you did today was not justice. It was the exact opposite. You didn't uphold the law, you abused it. Reed's face was flushed now, the realization of the situation hitting him like a ton of bricks. His hands fidgeted nervously at his sides, and he looked down, unable to meet the judge's gaze any longer. And to make matters worse, Judge Smith continued, my brother, the chief of police, has been working tirelessly to root out the kind of racist behavior you've displayed today from this very police force. Do you think he'll be pleased to hear about this? Reed's eyes widened in shock, his breath catching in his throat. Your brother is the chief. Judge Smith nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. Yes, Chief Smith, and I can assure you he will hear about this. He will hear about how one of his officers decided to harass my daughter simply because she didn't fit your idea of who should be driving a nice car. I'm so sorry, Sir, Reed blurted, his voice now desperate. I didn't realize. You didn't realize, Judge Smith repeated, his tone icy. And that, Officer Reed, is the problem. You didn't take the time to realize anything. You didn't ask the right questions. You didn't treat my daughter with the respect she deserved. You jumped to conclusions because of your own biases. And now you're facing the consequences. Reed looked down at the ground, shame washing over him as he struggled to process the magnitude of his mistake. Please, sir, he whispered, I truly didn't mean to cause any harm. I just want to apologize. But Judge Smith wasn't finished. Apologize to my daughter, he said, his voice firm. She's the one you wronged here, not me. Reed's eyes flicked toward Mika, who had been watching the entire exchange with a mixture of relief and lingering frustration. The officer swallowed hard, then stepped toward her window, his voice faltering as he spoke. I'm very sorry, miss, he said, his words stumbling over themselves. I was wrong to assume what I did, and I apologize for the way I treated you. It wasn't right. Mika didn't say anything at first. She simply stared at him, her mind still processing everything that had happened. Eventually, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, but the hurt and anger in her eyes remained. Judge Smith watched the interaction closely, his jaw tight with restrained anger. He knew that Reed's apology, while necessary, wasn't enough to erase the damage that had been done, but it was a small step toward accountability. Turning back to Reed, Judge Smith spoke again, his tone final. Officer Reed, I expect that you'll reflect on this experience and learn from it. The next time you pull someone over, you better treat them with the respect and dignity that every person deserves, regardless of the color of their skin. Reed nodded quickly, his face pale. Yes, sir, I will, I promise. Judge Smith gave a curt nod before turning back toward Mika's car. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his voice softening as he spoke to her. Let's go home, sweetheart. This is over now. Mika looked up at her father, the weight of the day's events still heavy on her heart. But with him beside her, she felt a sense of safety return. She nodded and started the car, grateful that her father had arrived when he did, though the lingering sting of what had happened wouldn't fade easily. As they drove away, Officer Reed remained standing by the side of the road, watching them leave, the full impact of his actions weighing heavily on his shoulders. Judge Smith stood tall, his eyes piercing through Officer Reed as the silence stretched between them. Mika, still shaken, sat in the car, watching her father confront the man who had wrongly profiled and humiliated her. Officer Reed, visibly uncomfortable, shifted on his feet, fumbling with the papers in his hands. He knew what was coming. He had crossed a line, and now he stood face to face with not just a father, but a Supreme Court judge, a man whose presence demanded respect and accountability. Judge Smith's voice, calm but firm, broke the tense silence. Officer Reed, I want to be perfectly clear, he began, each word deliberate and measured. What you did here today wasn't just a mistake. It was a violation of everything the justice system is supposed to stand for. You didn't protect anyone. You didn't serve the community. What you did was perpetuate the very thing that erodes the trust between the people and those sworn to protect. Give them racism. Reed opened his mouth to respond, but Judge Smith held up a hand, silencing him. No, I'm not finished. My daughter, an innocent 16-year-old girl, was treated like a criminal today. Not because of anything she did, but because of who she is. Because she's black. Because, in your mind, a black girl driving a nice car couldn't possibly be legitimate. And you assumed, without any evidence, that she must have stolen it. Reed's face flushed, his grip tightening around the papers in his hands. He had been wrong, and he knew it, but there was no way to undo the damage now. Judge Smith's eyes never left Reed's. Do you have any idea what that does to a young person? To be seen not for who they are, but for the color of their skin. To be presumed guilty before they've even had a chance to speak. It breaks something inside you. It plants seeds of fear and distrust, seeds that grow over time until they choke out any hope for fairness, for justice. Reed swallowed hard, his voice small as he tried to explain himself. Sir, I didn't. You didn't mean to. Judge Smith cut in sharply. That's the problem, isn't it? You didn't mean to, but you did it anyway. And that's why this is so dangerous. It's not just about the conscious overt acts of racism. It's about the assumptions you carry with you, the biases you let influence your decisions. You don't even realize you're doing it, but it affects every person you interact with. It affects lives. The weight of Judge Smith's words hung in the air, and for the first time, Officer Reed seemed to shrink under the gravity of the situation. He glanced toward Mika, who sat silently in the car, her expression still clouded with the pain and confusion of what had just happened. It was clear that his apology wouldn't be enough to make things right, not today, not ever. Judge Smith stepped forward, his voice lowering but losing none of its power. I want you to think about something, Officer Reed. My brother, the chief of police, has spent years trying to reform this department. He's implemented training, education, and workshops specifically designed to address racial bias within the force. You've attended these sessions, haven't you? Reed nodded, unable to find his voice. And yet, Judge Smith continued, here we are. After all that training, after all those efforts to make this department better, to make it fairer, you still fell back on your biases. You still let prejudice guide your actions. How do you think my brother will feel when he finds out what happened here today? Reed's face paled, his breath catching in his throat. I'm sorry, he stammered, his words barely audible. I didn't realize. You didn't realize, Judge Smith echoed, his voice softening slightly, though the intensity in his gaze remained. But that's the point, isn't it? You didn't realize because you haven't taken the time to reflect, to examine your own biases. And until you do, this will keep happening to my daughter, to other young people like her, to anyone who doesn't fit into the narrow box you've created in your mind. Reed looked down, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped his hat. The shame was palpable, but Judge Smith wasn't finished. The time for apologies has passed, he said, his voice firm once more. What we need now is change. You can't keep going through the motions, pretending that these issues don't exist. You can't ignore the fact that systemic racism is real, and it exists right here in this police department. It's your responsibility to confront it. It's your duty to make sure that the next time you pull someone over, you do so with fairness, with respect, and without the weight of your biases guiding your actions. Reed nodded, his voice barely a whisper as he spoke. Yes, sir, I understand. Judge Smith studied him for a moment longer before finally stepping back. Good, he said, his tone softening slightly, because this isn't just about you and my daughter. This is about the system you're a part of. It's about every officer who makes decisions like the ones you made today, and it's about making sure those decisions don't keep hurting innocent people. There was a brief pause as Judge Smith allowed his words to sink in, the weight of them pressing down on both Reed and the moment. Then, he continued, his voice taking on a finality that left no room for doubt. The fight against racism doesn't end with a single conversation. It doesn't end with one apology. It's a continuous effort, a commitment to being better, to doing better. And that responsibility starts with you. It starts with each of us. If we're going to eradicate racism from our institutions, from our communities, then we need to look in the mirror and ask ourselves how we're contributing to the problem and how we can be part of the solution. Mika, sitting quietly in the car, felt a surge of pride swell in her chest. Her father's words, powerful and full of conviction, resonated not just with Officer Reed, but with her as well. She had experienced firsthand the pain and frustration of being judged for something she couldn't change, but now she saw the path forward, the path her father had laid out for them all. Judge Smith took a step back, his gaze still locked on Reed. "I expect you to think long and hard about what happened here today, Officer Reed. And I expect you to do better. Not just for my daughter's sake, but for the sake of every person you serve in this community. Because until you do, the trust between the people and the police will continue to erode. And that is something none of us can afford." Reed nodded once more, his expression solemn as he met Judge Smith's gaze. "I will, sir. I promise." Judge Smith gave a curt nod, then turned toward Mika, his expression softening as he approached the car. "Let's go home, sweetheart," he said gently, his hand resting on her shoulder as he opened the door. Mika glanced back at Officer Reed one last time before turning to her father. "Thanks, Dad," she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. Judge Smith smiled down at her, his voice warm and steady. "Any time, honey. Let's go." As they drove away, the weight of the day's events still lingered, but Mika knew that her father's words had made an impact. And though the road ahead would be long, she felt hopeful that conversations like the one today could bring about real change one step at a time.